The gunshot came before I even understood what was happening, and I dropped to the wet pavement with my hands over my head, certain that the next sound I heard would be my own name spoken over a hospital intercom, or worse, not spoken at all. I am Hannah Pierce, and until that night, I had lived a life so quiet that most people forgot I existed the moment I left a room. I worked at a small print shop near the edge of the city, folding brochures and answering phones, and I walked home every evening along the same 3 streets, because the bus fare was money I could not spare. My coworkers made jokes about my weight when they thought I could not hear them. My own sister told me once that I would be pretty if I simply tried harder. I had stopped expecting kindness from strangers a long time ago. That evening, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and orange bleeding into each other over the rooftops, and I remember thinking it was beautiful in a sad sort of way, the kind of beauty you notice when nothing in your own life feels beautiful at all. I had my earbuds in, listening to nothing in particular, just background noise to drown out the ache of another long day. I turned down the alley that cut behind the old textile building because it saved me 10 minutes, a habit born from years of walking the same path without a single problem. That night the pattern broke. I heard shouting first, low and urgent, men's voices overlapping each other in a language I recognized but could not place. Then a car door slammed somewhere close, and I froze the way small animals freeze when a predator crosses their path, hoping stillness would make me invisible. It did not work. 2 men stepped out from behind a stack of shipping containers, and one of them was pointing a gun at the other, hands shaking with something that looked like fear dressed up as anger. I should have turned and run. Every instinct told me to run. Instead, my body locked in place, my mind screaming at my legs to move, while my legs simply refused, and that single second of hesitation nearly cost me everything. The gun went off. I do not know if the shot was meant for me or for the man standing near me, and in that moment it did not matter, because the world narrowed down to the sound and the flash and the certainty that I was about to die on a wet street that nobody would remember my name from. I threw myself against the brick wall, my knees hitting the ground hard enough to bruise, and I waited for pain that never came. Instead, a shadow fell over me. A man stepped between me and the gunman with the calm, deliberate movement of someone who had done this before, someone whose body understood danger the way mine understood fear. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a dark coat that should have looked out of place in an alley full of violence but somehow did not. He did not flinch when a second shot rang out. He simply raised his own weapon, fired once, and the man who had been pointing a gun at us crumpled to the ground and did not move again. The silence afterward was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I could not breathe. I could not think. All I could do was stare up at the stranger who had just saved my life, my whole body trembling so hard my teeth clicked together. He turned toward me slowly, and when his eyes found mine, I expected to see nothing there, the same emptiness I imagined a person would need to end another person's life so quickly and without hesitation. Instead, I saw something sharp and assessing, a mind working fast, calculating risk the way other people calculated grocery bills. "Can you walk?" he asked. His voice was low, rough at the edges, not unkind but not gentle either. I could not answer. My throat had closed around every word I tried to form. He crouched down in front of me, and up close, I could see a thin scar along his jaw, the kind of mark that told a story I did not want to know the ending of. "Look at me," he said, and something in his tone made me obey without deciding to. "You are in danger right now. Not from me. From the people who are going to come looking for the man I just stopped. Do you understand what I am telling you?" I shook my head because I did not understand, not really, not in any way that made sense to a woman whose biggest daily worry had been whether she would be teased for the way her uniform fit. "You saw his face," the man said, nodding toward the body a few feet away, though I refused to look at it. "That makes you a witness, to men like the ones who sent him. A witness is a loose thread, and loose threads get cut." Somewhere behind us, more shouting rose up, closer now, and the man's expression shifted into something harder, something that made the air around us feel colder. He reached down and closed his hand around my wrist, not roughly, but with a grip that told me refusal was not an option he was offering. "My name is Damian Cross," he said, pulling me to my feet as though I weighed nothing at all, though I knew exactly how much I weighed, and exactly how the world usually treated women who weighed what I did. I am not going to hurt you, but if you stay here, someone else will. Come with me now, and we can argue about the rest of it later. I would like to say I made a brave choice in that moment, that I decided to trust him, because something in his eyes convinced me he was telling the truth. The truth is simpler and less flattering. I went with him because my legs finally started working again, and running toward the man who had just killed to protect me felt safer than running toward the voices closing in from the other direction. He led me at a fast walk through a gap between two buildings I never would have noticed on my own, out onto a side street where a black car sat waiting, with its engine already running. A younger man stood beside it, scanning the street with sharp, nervous eyes, and when he saw us, he yanked the back door open without a single question. "Get in," Damien said. I hesitated for half a second, some small voice in my head warning me that getting into a stranger's car after watching him shoot a man was possibly the worst decision I had ever made. But the shouting behind us grew louder, and my body made the decision before my mind could finish arguing with itself. I climbed inside, and Damien slid in beside me, and the car pulled away from the curb so smoothly it felt like the street itself was letting us go. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I stared out the window as familiar streets blurred past, streets I had walked 1,000 times, streets that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else's city. My hands would not stop shaking. I pressed them together in my lap, trying to hide it, though I doubted anything escaped the notice of the man sitting beside me. "You're safe," Damien said finally, not looking at me, his eyes fixed on the side mirror as though he was still counting threats. "Whatever else happens tonight, understand that you are safe." "Who were those men?" My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Enemies," he said simply, as if the word explained everything. "Mine, not yours, until tonight." "What does that mean, until tonight?" He finally turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw something almost like regret cross his face, quickly hidden the way I imagined a man like him hid most things. "It means you're involved now, whether either of us wanted that or not. I am sorry for that." "I am not sorry I stopped him from shooting you." I did not know what to say to that. Nobody had ever apologized to me and defended their own actions in the same breath before, as though both things could be true at once, as though my safety and his violence were simply two sides of the same decision. I studied his profile in the passing streetlights, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his hands rested loosely on his knees, even though I could tell every muscle in his body was still coiled tight, ready to react. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Somewhere they won't find you tonight," he said. "We'll sort out the rest in the morning." I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand he take me home, back to my small apartment with its leaking faucet and its lonely silence, back to a life that made sense, even when it made me unhappy. But some instinct, sharper than fear, told me that home was no longer the safe place it used to be, not as long as the men who had wanted me dead in that alley knew which streets I walked and which door I locked behind me each night. The car left the city behind, climbing toward hills I had only ever seen from a distance, dark shapes against a darker sky. Damien said nothing more, and I found myself grateful for the silence, grateful for the chance to breathe, without having to explain the tears that kept threatening to spill no matter how many times I blinked them back. I did not know yet what kind of man had just changed the entire direction of my life. I did not know about the empire he ruled, the enemies who circled him like sharks scenting blood, or the danger that would follow both of us in the days ahead. All I knew was that a stranger with a gun and a scar on his jaw had looked at me, an overlooked woman nobody usually noticed, and decided I was worth protecting. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself believe that might be true. The car slowed as it approached a set of iron gates set into a high stone wall, and beyond them, I could just make out the shape of a house so large, it looked more like a fortress than a home. Guards appeared out of the shadows to open the gates, nodding to Damien with quiet respect, though their eyes lingered on me with open curiosity. "This is where you'll stay," Damien said, as the car rolled up a long drive lined with dark trees. "For now." I turned to look at him, 100 questions crowding my throat at once, but before I could ask a single one, he spoke again, quiet and certain, as though he had already made a decision I had no part in. "Whatever happens inside those walls," he said, "you do not leave my side. Not until I know you're safe. Do you understand?" I did not understand. Not fully. Not yet. But I nodded anyway, because something about the way he said it made me believe he meant every word, and because some small, frightened part of me had already decided that I wanted to trust him, even though I barely knew his name. The car stopped. Damien stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand to help me from the seat, an old-fashioned gesture that felt strange coming from a man who had killed someone less than an hour earlier. I took it anyway. Whatever waited for me beyond those gates, I was about to find out that my old life, the quiet, overlooked, unremarkable life I had lived for 26 years, was already gone. I just did not yet understand how completely it had ended, or what it would mean to become, in the eyes of everyone inside that house, the woman Damien Cross had chosen to protect with his own life. The inside of the house was nothing like I expected, and I stood frozen in the entryway for a long moment, taking in the wide staircase, the polished floors, the quiet hum of a life built on money I could not begin to imagine. Everything about the space felt controlled, deliberate. The way I imagined Damien himself was controlled and deliberate, right down to the way the light fell across the marble floor. A woman appeared from a side hallway, older, silver-haired, wearing an apron over a simple gray dress. Her eyes found me first, sweeping over my rumpled clothes and my tear-streaked face, and I braced myself for the look I had grown used to over the years, the quick, dismissive glance that told me exactly where I ranked in a stranger's estimation. Instead, her expression softened. "Oh, you poor thing," she said, stepping forward. "Let's get you warm." "Grace," Damien said, and the woman turned toward him immediately. "She stays in the East Wing. Nobody goes near her without my permission." "Nobody." "Of course," Grace said, though I saw the question flicker behind her eyes, the same question I imagined every person in that house would soon be asking. Who was I, and why did the most feared man in the city suddenly care whether I was warm? I found out the answer to that question faster than I expected, and in a way I never could have predicted. Grace led me toward a sitting room, while Damien disappeared down another hallway, his phone already pressed to his ear, his voice low and clipped as he issued instructions I could not fully hear. I sank onto a couch that probably cost more than a year of my salary, and Grace pressed a cup of tea into my shaking hands, murmuring something gentle about shock and warm liquids, the kind of practical kindness that undid me more than anything else that night had. I do not know how long I sat there before the sound of raised voices reached me from somewhere deeper in the house. I could not make out the words, only the tone, sharp and argumentative, several men speaking over each other. Grace's face tightened, though she said nothing, simply refilled my cup and sat beside me as though her presence alone might shield me from whatever storm was building beyond those walls. The voices grew louder, and then the door to the sitting room opened, and Damien stepped through it, followed by 3 men I had never seen before. One of them, older, with graying hair at his temples and a suit that fit him like armor, looked at me with open disbelief. "This is her?" he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Damien, we lost 2 men tonight because of what happened in that alley. Victor Lane is going to use this as an excuse to move against us, and you want to bring a stranger into the house?" "Watch your tone, Marcus," Damien said, and though his voice did not rise, something in it made the room go still. "She is not a stranger. She is a witness who nearly died because of a war she has nothing to do with. I am not leaving her exposed. So put her somewhere safe, a hotel, a safe house across the city. You do not need to bring her here, into the middle of everything we're trying to protect." I shrank back into the couch cushions, wishing I could disappear entirely, hating the way the men in the room studied me like a problem to be solved, rather than a person who had simply wanted to walk home from work. This, I thought, was exactly the kind of moment I had spent my whole life avoiding. The moment when a room full of people debated my worth as though I could not hear every word. Damien's jaw tightened. He crossed the room in a few long strides and stood directly in front of Marcus, close enough that the older man took an involuntary step back. "Let me be clear," Damien said, his voice low and even, more dangerous for its calm than any shout could have been. "She is under my protection, as far as anyone outside this room needs to know, and as far as anyone inside it needs to understand, she is my wife. The room went silent. I nearly dropped my teacup. Your wife, Marcus repeated slowly, as though testing whether the words made sense in any order. That is what I said. Damien did not look at me when he said it, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that dared anyone to argue. Victor's men saw a woman in that alley. If word gets out that she is nothing more than a random witness, she becomes a target he can use to draw me out. Or worse, a loose end he decides to eliminate outright. But if she is my wife, touching her means starting a war he is not prepared to fight. It changes the calculation entirely. I understood, in a distant, numb sort of way, that he was speaking pure strategy, the same cold calculation that had likely kept him alive through years of danger I could not imagine. And yet something about the declaration still landed somewhere deep inside me, some old, aching part of myself that had never once been chosen first, never been the reason a room full of powerful men fell silent. Marcus looked at me again, and this time his expression shifted, calculating rather than dismissive. And if she talks, if she runs the moment she gets a chance, straight to the police, or worse, straight to Lane's people looking for a payout. She won't, Damien said, before I could even open my mouth to answer for myself. You're certain of that? I am. I wanted to ask him how he could possibly be certain of anything about a woman he had known for less than 2 hours, but the confidence in his voice left no room for questions, and some part of me, tired and frightened and desperate for someone to simply decide things on my behalf for once, was grateful for it. The other 2 men in the room, both younger, both watching the exchange with careful neutrality, said nothing, though I noticed the way their eyes moved between Damien and me, recalculating something, adjusting to a new reality none of us had expected an hour earlier. Fine, Marcus said finally, though his tone made clear the matter was far from settled in his own mind. But you understand what you're risking. If this gets out and it's a lie, Lane's people will see straight through it, and it will look like weakness, like you needed a shield. Then we make sure it doesn't look like a lie, Damien said, and something in the way he said it made my stomach drop, though I could not yet name why. The men filed out of the room one by one, Marcus last, casting one final unreadable look in my direction before the door closed behind him. Grace, who had remained silent through the entire exchange, quietly refilled my tea again, though my hands were shaking too badly to lift the cup. Damien crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from me, closer than I expected, close enough that I could see the exhaustion beginning to show through the controlled surface he presented to everyone else. I should have asked you first, he said, and the admission surprised me almost as much as the declaration itself had. I am sorry, there wasn't time. Am I actually supposed to be your wife? The question came out smaller and more uncertain than I intended, my voice cracking slightly on the last word. In name only, for as long as it takes to make sure Victor Lane's people believe there's nothing left to gain by hurting you, Damien said. I know it's not what you wanted for your life. I know none of this is what you wanted, but I promise you this. Nobody in this house will touch you, and nobody outside it will get close enough to try. I studied his face, searching for some sign that this was all a performance, another layer of the same cold calculation Marcus had accused him of. Instead, I saw something quieter, something almost like guilt, the expression of a man who understood exactly how much he was asking of a woman he had pulled out of danger less than 2 hours ago. Okay, I said, because I did not know what else there was to say, because the alternative, going back out into a city where men with guns knew my face, terrified me more than staying inside walls guarded by a man who had already proven he would kill to keep me breathing. Something shifted in his expression, a fraction of tension leaving his shoulders. Okay, he echoed. That first night, after the men had left the sitting room, and Grace had finally coaxed me into eating a small plate of bread and soup, I lay awake in the unfamiliar bed in the east wing, staring at a ceiling I did not recognize, replaying the sound of gunfire and the strange, unearned comfort of being called someone's wife by a man I had known for less than a day. I thought about my apartment, my leaking faucet, the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen counter, and wondered if any of it would even miss me if I never went back. It was a bleak thought, and I was almost ashamed of how little it frightened me. I woke the next morning to the sound of birds outside my window. A sound so ordinary and peaceful that for a moment I forgot entirely where I was. Then memory returned in a rush. The alley, the gunshot, Damien's hand closing around my wrist, and I sat up quickly, my heart pounding, as though the danger might still be standing in the doorway. It was not danger waiting for me, only Grace, carrying a folded set of clothes and a gentle, knowing smile, as though she understood exactly how disorienting a night like the one I'd had could be. "These should fit," she said, setting the clothes on the end of the bed. "Mr. Cross had them brought in early this morning. He said to tell you there's no rush. Breakfast whenever you're ready." I dressed slowly, running my hands over fabric softer than anything I owned, and caught my own reflection in a tall mirror near the window. I looked tired, pale, my eyes rimmed red from a night of half-sleep and quiet crying, but I also looked, strangely, like someone who had survived something. I was not sure yet what to do with that feeling. Over the following days, I learned quickly that being Damien Cross's wife, even a wife in name only, changed everything about how the house treated me. Grace fussed over meals, as though feeding me properly was a personal mission. The guards who patrolled the grounds nodded to me with quiet respect whenever I passed, a stark contrast to the curious stares I had received that first night. Even Marcus, though still openly skeptical, began addressing me directly, instead of talking around me as though I could not hear. I was given a room in the east wing, large and quiet, with tall windows overlooking gardens that had clearly once been beautiful, and were slowly being reclaimed by careful hands. I spent my first few days mostly alone, unsure of my place in a house so large it seemed to swallow sound, unsure of the boundaries of my new, strange existence. Damien was gone often, disappearing for hours at a time on business he never explained, returning with a tightness around his eyes that told me whatever he was managing outside those walls was not going well. But every evening, without fail, he found a few minutes to check on me, standing awkwardly in my doorway, as though he was not entirely sure what to say to a woman he had claimed as his wife, but barely knew as a person. "You don't have to check on me every night," I told him, on the fourth evening, when he appeared in my doorway looking more tired than usual. "I know," he said, but he did not leave, and something in the way he lingered told me the checking was not entirely about strategy anymore. It was on the fifth night that everything nearly fell apart, when Marcus stormed into the small sitting room where I had been reading, his expression thunderous, a folder clutched in one hand like a weapon. "We have a problem," he said, not to me, but to Damien, who had followed him in a moment later. "Lane knows. Somehow, he already knows the marriage is fake." I felt the blood drain from my face. Whatever safety I had begun to feel inside those walls evaporated in an instant, replaced by the same cold, alley-dark fear I remembered from that first night, the certainty that danger had found me again, despite every wall meant to keep it out. "Explain," Damien said, his voice flat and controlled in a way that somehow felt more frightening than shouting would have. Marcus dropped the folder onto the table between us, and I stared at it without touching it, as though the papers inside might bite me. One of Lane's men was overheard at a bar downtown, bragging that Damien Cross had to invent a wife to cover up a mistake in the alley. He named her. Marcus's eyes flicked to me. "He named you, Hannah, by name, which means somebody inside this house is talking to people outside it." The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in around me. I set down the book I had been holding, my fingers numb. How would he know my name? I never told anyone outside this house who I was. "That's the problem," Marcus said grimly. "Somebody inside this house did." Damien's expression had gone very still, the particular stillness I was beginning to recognize as the calm before something dangerous. Who else knew her name besides the four of us in that room the first night? "Grace," Marcus said, "the two guards who brought the car around, and whoever compiled her file when we ran the standard background check." "Get me that list," Damien said. "Every name. I want to know who had access to it." Marcus nodded and left the room, and for a long moment neither Damien nor I spoke. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to steady the tremor that had started somewhere in my chest and was working its way outward into my hands. "Someone in your own house is betraying you," I said quietly. "Doesn't that scare you?" Damien sat down across from me, his eyes searching my face with an intensity that made me want to look away, and made it impossible to do so at the same time. It should. Most days I don't have time to be scared of anything. I have time to be careful, and time to react. Fear is a luxury I stopped affording myself a long time ago. That sounds lonely, I said, before I could stop myself. Something flickered across his face, quick and unguarded, gone almost before I registered it. It is, he admitted. I didn't expect anyone to notice that. We sat in silence after that, though it was a different kind of silence than the awkward, careful quiet that had defined most of our interactions over the past days. This silence felt almost companionable, two people who understood, in their own separate ways, what it meant to be underestimated, and overlooked, and quietly, persistently strong despite it. "Can I ask you something?" I said finally. "You can ask. Why did you actually stop that night?" "In the alley. You didn't know me. You could have kept walking, or let your men handle it, or 100 other things that wouldn't have put your own operation at risk. Why did you step in front of a gun for a stranger?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed somewhere past me, on some memory I could not see. "Because I watched you freeze," he said finally, "and I recognized it. I've seen that particular kind of fear before, the fear of someone who has spent their whole life being told, in 100 small ways, that they don't matter enough for anyone to fight for them. I saw it, and something in me refused to let that be true for you. Not that night." I did not know what to say to that. Nobody had ever put words to the exact shape of the wound I had carried since childhood, the quiet, persistent belief that I was simply less than other people, less worthy of protection, less worthy of being chosen. Hearing Damien name it so plainly, without pity, without softness, undid something in me that I had spent years carefully holding together. "Thank you," I whispered, because it was the only thing that felt true enough to say. He nodded once, and something passed between us in that silence, fragile and new, a thread of understanding neither of us had expected to find in the middle of so much danger. Over the following 2 weeks, that thread grew stronger, even as the threat from Victor Lane grew sharper around the edges. Damien began seeking me out, not just to check on my safety, but simply to talk, appearing in the evenings with 2 cups of tea and settling into the chair across from mine, as though it had always been his habit. I learned that he had grown up with nothing, that the empire he now ran had been built brick by brutal brick, out of a childhood where hunger and violence were simply facts of daily life. I learned that Grace had worked for his mother before him, one of the few people in his life who had known him before the man he'd had to become. In turn, I found myself telling him things I had never said aloud to anyone, not even the few friends I had managed to keep through years of quiet loneliness. I told him about my sister's careless cruelty, about the coworkers who whispered behind their hands, about the particular exhaustion of moving through a world that seemed determined to make you feel invisible and hypervisible at the same time, judged for a body you had stopped trying to explain or defend. He listened. He did not offer easy comfort or hollow compliments. He simply listened, his attention so complete and so focused that for the first time in my adult life, I felt truly heard. One afternoon, restless and unused to so much idle time, I wandered into the estate's kitchen and found Grace elbow-deep in flour, muttering to herself about a recipe her own mother used to make. Without quite deciding to, I asked if I could help, and she looked at me with such open surprise that I nearly retreated, certain I had overstepped some invisible line. Instead, she handed me an apron and put me to work kneading dough, correcting my technique with patient good humor, telling me stories about Damien as a boy, quiet and watchful even then, the kind of child who noticed everything and said very little. "He used to sit right there," she said, nodding toward a stool tucked into the corner, "and watch me cook for hours. Never asked for anything, just liked being near people who weren't shouting." Her voice softened. It took him a long time to learn that not every room has to be survived. I thought about that for the rest of the day, the image of a small, silent boy learning to make himself invisible in a house full of danger, not so different from the woman I had become in my own quieter, less violent way. It made something in my chest ache, with a tenderness I had not expected to feel for a man who commanded fear from grown men twice his guard's size. It was during one of these evenings that I noticed the way his guards had started treating me differently, not just with the polite deference owed to a boss's wife, but with something closer to genuine warmth. A young guard named Leo, who patrolled the East Wing most nights, had taken to bringing me a second cup of coffee each morning, without being asked, simply because he'd noticed I preferred it strong. Grace had started including me in small decisions about the household, asking my opinion on meals or flowers, as though my preferences mattered, as though I belonged somewhere in the fabric of this strange, dangerous, unexpectedly warm household. I mentioned this to Damien one evening, half joking, half genuinely moved. "Your men have started treating me like I actually belong here." "You do belong here," he said, without hesitation, and something in the certainty of his tone made my chest ache in a way I did not fully understand. But even as warmth grew inside those walls, danger crept closer outside them. Marcus's investigation into the leak turned up nothing conclusive at first, every lead dissolving into dead ends and half-answers. Then, on a quiet evening nearly 3 weeks after the incident in the alley, I overheard something I was never meant to hear. I had gone looking for Damien in his study, a room I rarely entered, to ask a small, forgettable question about dinner. The door was slightly open, and I heard voices before I saw anyone. Marcus's voice, low and urgent, speaking to someone on the phone. "I told you. It's handled," Marcus was saying. "Lane doesn't need to move yet. Just be patient. Everything is going according to plan." I froze in the hallway, my hand still raised to knock, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just heard. According to plan. As though Marcus and Victor Lane's people shared a plan, as though the man Damien trusted most in the world was speaking to their greatest enemy as though they were old, familiar allies. I stepped back from the door as quietly as I could manage, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain Marcus would hear it through the wall. I retreated down the hallway, my mind spinning, uncertain what to do with the knowledge I had just stumbled into. If I told Damien, and I was wrong, I would have accused his closest advisor, a man who had known him for years, of betrayal based on a single overheard fragment of conversation. But if I said nothing, and I was right, the consequences could be far worse than anything that had happened in that alley 3 weeks ago. I found Damien in the sitting room a short while later, and I must have looked as shaken as I felt, because he rose immediately from his chair, concern sharpening his features. "What happened?" he asked. I told him everything, the words tumbling out faster than I intended, the phrase "according to plan" echoing in my mind even as I repeated it aloud. Damien's expression grew increasingly still as I spoke, the same dangerous calm I had seen the night Marcus first brought news of the leak. "You're certain of what you heard?" he asked, when I finished. "I'm certain," I said. "I know it's not proof. I know it could mean something else entirely, but I couldn't not tell you." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes distant with calculation. "Marcus has been with me for 11 years, he said finally, more to himself than to me. "He was there before any of this, before the money, before the territory. I trusted him with everything." "I could be wrong," I said quickly, hating the doubt I saw building behind his eyes, hating that I might have planted a seed of suspicion against a man who had earned Damien's loyalty over a decade of service. "You could be," Damien agreed, "or you could have just saved both our lives." He looked at me then, something fierce and unreadable in his expression. "Either way, I need to know for certain, and I need you to stay close to me until I do. If Marcus is compromised, and if he knows you overheard him, you are in more danger right now than you were that first night in the alley." The warmth I had allowed myself to feel over the past 3 weeks curdled instantly into fear, sharp and familiar, the same fear that had frozen me in place while gunfire echoed off brick walls. I had come to believe, foolishly perhaps, that the danger surrounding this house was something that happened at its edges, something Damien's strength and vigilance kept safely at bay. Now I understood that the danger might already be inside, wearing a familiar face, waiting for the right moment to strike. I thought of Leo, bringing me coffee each morning without being asked, of Grace, teaching me her mother's recipes, of the quiet, ordinary warmth that had grown inside a house I had once believed only capable of danger. If Marcus was truly working against Damien, all of that warmth was standing on ground far less solid than I had allowed myself to believe. The thought frightened me more than the memory of gunfire ever had, because gunfire, at least, was a danger I could see coming. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Damien reached out and, for the first time since that first night in the car, took my hand in his grip firm and grounding. Now, he said, we find out exactly how deep this goes, and we make sure that whatever happens next, you walk away from it alive. I believed him. I wanted to believe him with every part of myself that had learned, over the past 3 weeks, what it felt like to matter to someone. But even as his hand held mine steady, I could not shake the cold certainty settling in my chest that the worst danger of this entire ordeal was still ahead of us, waiting just beyond the edge of what either of us could yet see. The days that followed moved with a tension I had never experienced before. Every conversation weighted with suspicion, every glance from Marcus feeling like a threat I could not prove. Damien moved carefully, giving no sign that anything had changed, continuing to include Marcus in meetings and decisions, as though nothing had shifted between them. I understood the strategy even as it terrified me. If Marcus suspected we knew, he would either flee or accelerate whatever plan he had been building with Victor Lane, and Damien needed time to confirm the truth before either of those things could happen. Leo, the young guard who had grown fond of bringing me coffee each morning, became an unexpected ally during those tense days. Damien trusted him completely, and it was Leo who quietly began tracking Marcus's movements, noting the calls he made from phones that weren't his usual line, the meetings he took outside the estate that he never fully explained. In those 4 tense days, I found myself watching Marcus with a kind of careful, painful attention, searching his face across the dinner table for some sign of the betrayal I now believed was real. He seemed, if anything, more relaxed than usual, laughing at something Grace said, asking after my garden with what appeared to be genuine interest, and I began to doubt myself all over again, wondering if I had misheard, if I had let fear twist an innocent conversation into something sinister. Damien, when I confessed this doubt to him quietly one evening, only shook his head. That's exactly how he's survived this long, he said. Marcus was always the best actor I ever met. It's why I trusted him for 11 years without a single doubt. Don't let his calm fool you into thinking you imagined what you heard. Still, the waiting wore on both of us. I found it harder to sleep, harder to sit through meals without my hands trembling faintly beneath the table, harder to meet Marcus's eyes without wondering what he might already suspect about what I knew. Leo, sensing my unease, took to walking me between rooms during those days, an unspoken bodyguard, never quite explaining why, and I never asked, grateful simply for the quiet reassurance of his presence. 4 days after I overheard that phone call, Leo brought Damien proof. A photograph of Marcus meeting with a man Damien recognized instantly, one of Victor Lane's closest lieutenants, the two of them speaking quietly outside a restaurant on the far side of the city, an exchange of what looked unmistakably like a folder of documents. I was in the room when Damien saw the photograph, and I watched something in him go cold and still, in a way I had never witnessed before, not even that first night in the alley. Whatever warmth had grown between us over the past weeks disappeared behind a mask of controlled fury, the mask of a man preparing to do something he had hoped never to do again. 11 years, he said quietly, staring at the photograph. 11 years, and he sells me out for whatever Lane promised him. What are you going to do? I asked, though some part of me already feared the answer. I'm going to end this, Damien said, tonight, before he has the chance to do any more damage. But Marcus, it turned out, was watching more closely than any of us realized. That evening, while Damien met with Leo and 2 other trusted guards to plan how they would confront Marcus quietly, without alerting the rest of the household, I sat alone in my room, unable to focus on anything except the growing dread pressing against my chest. I did not hear the door open behind me. I only heard Marcus's voice, low and almost gentle, which frightened me more than shouting would have. You should have stayed out of things that don't concern you, Hannah. I turned, and my blood ran cold at the sight of the gun in his hand, pointed loosely in my direction, his expression tired rather than angry, the look of a man who had made peace with doing something terrible. Damien knows, I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to keep it steady. He has proof. Whatever you're planning, it's already over. I know he knows, Marcus said, which is exactly why I need you to come with me right now, quietly, before he finishes whatever he's planning downstairs. You're the only piece I have left to play, Hannah. Lane wants Damien distracted, and nothing distracts him faster than you being in danger. Fear closed around my throat like a physical hand, but somewhere beneath it, something Damien had said weeks earlier surfaced in my mind, quiet and steady. I recognized that particular kind of fear, he had told me, the fear of someone who believed they didn't matter enough for anyone to fight for them. I was done believing that. Damien had spent weeks proving otherwise, and I was not going to make it easy for Marcus to erase that truth now. If you're going to force me somewhere, I said, forcing steadiness into my voice, at least let me put on real shoes. It was a small, foolish request, the kind of ordinary detail that might buy me a few seconds, and to my relief, Marcus nodded impatiently, gesturing toward the closet with the gun. I moved slowly, deliberately, and as I reached for a pair of shoes, I let my hand brush against a small dish on the dresser, where I kept loose coins and a spare hair clip, knocking it quietly to the floor. It was not much, but it was something. A small trail of evidence that Leo, who checked my room every night out of habit, might notice was out of place. Marcus marched me down a back staircase I had never used before, out through a service entrance that led into the gardens, toward a gate in the estate wall that clearly had been left unlocked in advance. My mind raced, cataloging every detail I could manage, the direction we walked, the make of the car waiting beyond the gate, anything that might help Damien find me if I survived long enough for that to matter. The car ride was silent and terrifying, Marcus's hands steady on the wheel despite the enormity of what he had just done, betraying a man he had served for over a decade. I studied his face in the dim light from passing street lamps, searching for some sign of the guilt I desperately wanted to believe he still carried. Why? I finally asked. After 11 years, why betray him now? Marcus's jaw tightened. Lane offered me something Damien never could. My own territory, my own name, instead of always being the man standing one step behind someone else's throne. He glanced at me briefly. You wouldn't understand. You've spent your whole life being overlooked. I've spent mine being almost powerful, which is worse. I did understand, more than he realized, the particular ache of wanting to matter, of wanting your name to mean something in a room. But I also understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that some hungers led people toward becoming someone worth admiring, and others led them toward becoming exactly the kind of man willing to sell out the person who trusted him most. I said nothing more, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of understanding. We arrived at a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, the kind of forgotten building that seemed built specifically for exactly this sort of danger. Marcus led me inside at gunpoint, into a large open room where two more men waited, one of them the lieutenant I recognized from the photograph Leo had captured. You got her, the lieutenant said, sounding almost surprised. Cross is going to tear the city apart looking for her. That's the point, Marcus said. Let him tear it apart. While he's distracted, Lane moves on the West District operations, and by the time Cross realizes what's actually happening, it will already be finished. I stood there, hands trembling, forcing myself to remain calm, to keep listening, to memorize every detail I could, in case I somehow survived to share it. Meanwhile, back at the estate, I would later learn, Leo had discovered my empty room, the overturned dish of coins, the faint scuff marks near the service entrance that told a careful eye exactly which direction to search. Damien's reaction, when he realized what had happened, was described to me later by Grace in hushed, almost reverent tones, as though she had never witnessed anything like it in all her years working for his family. He had gone through the house like a storm, she said, methodical and terrifying, gathering every resource, every loyal man, every scrap of information Leo had collected, moving with a speed and precision that left no room for panic, only action. Back in the warehouse, hours passed in tense uncertainty. Marcus paced near the window, checking his phone repeatedly, his earlier calm fraying at the edges as time stretched on without word from Lane's people about whatever operation they had planned. I sat where they had left me, hands bound loosely to a metal chair, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to conserve whatever strength I would need if a chance to run ever presented itself. At one point, the lieutenant crouched in front of me, studying my face with an expression somewhere between curiosity and pity. You could have just been a witness, he said. Wrong place, wrong time, gone home to your quiet little life. Instead, you fell in love with the wrong man's protection. I did not answer him, though the accusation lodged itself somewhere painful and true beneath my ribs. Whatever this was between Damien and me, it had already grown into something I was no longer willing to pretend away, even sitting bound to a chair in a stranger's warehouse, with my life hanging on the outcome of a war I had never chosen to join. It was near midnight when the warehouse door exploded inward, and chaos erupted so suddenly, I barely had time to press myself down and away from the line of fire. Damien moved through the smoke and confusion, like something out of a nightmare belonging entirely to his enemies, controlled and lethal, Leo and 2 other guards moving in careful coordination beside him. I will not pretend the confrontation that followed was anything but frightening, the kind of violence I hoped never to witness again in my life. But it ended quickly, decisively. Lane's lieutenant and his men subdued before they could mount any real resistance, and Marcus, cornered near the far wall, dropping his weapon the moment he understood there was no path left that did not end in his own destruction. Damien crossed the room to me first, before anything else, cutting the bindings from my wrists with hands that were not quite steady, his eyes searching my face and body for any sign of injury with an intensity that made my chest ache. I'm okay, I told him, before he could ask. I'm okay, Damien. He pulled me against him then, one arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders, and I felt something in him finally release, some tension he had been carrying since the moment he realized I was gone. I thought I was too late, he said quietly, his voice rough in a way I had never heard from him before. I thought I had lost you. You didn't, I said, my voice muffled against his coat. You found me. Behind us, I heard Marcus being restrained, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to explain, to bargain, but Damien did not turn to look at him, his attention entirely fixed on me, on the simple, overwhelming fact that I was alive and standing in front of him. I need you to know something, Damien said quietly, pulling back just enough to look at my face. This stopped being about protection a long time ago. I need you to know that. Whatever happens next, this was never just about keeping a witness safe. I looked up at him, my heart hammering with something that was no longer fear, and for the first time since that terrifying night in the alley, I let myself believe that whatever came next, I would not be facing it alone. The weeks after the warehouse passed differently than any weeks I had lived before, quieter in a way that felt earned rather than empty. Marcus was gone, dealt with according to rules I did not ask Damien to explain, and Victor Lane, stripped of the advantage he had been counting on, retreated from open conflict, unwilling to risk further losses against an enemy who had just proven how far he would go to protect what belonged to him. Grace told me once, quietly, that she had never seen the house feel so settled, so free of the particular tension that had haunted its halls for as long as she had worked there. I found myself settling too, in ways I never expected. The garden beneath my window, the one I had noticed that first sleepless night, slowly transformed under my hesitant attention, weeks of careful pruning and planting, turning tangled neglect into something quietly beautiful. Leo took to joining me some mornings, offering opinions on flowers with more confidence than I expected from a man who spent most of his days armed and watchful. Grace taught me to cook dishes from her own childhood, patient with my mistakes, in a kitchen that had once felt as foreign to me as the rest of the estate. In those early weeks after the warehouse, I noticed small changes in myself that surprised me more than any of the changes happening around me. I stopped flinching when guards passed close by in the hallway. I stopped apologizing for taking up space at the dinner table, for asking for a second helping, for laughing too loudly at something Grace said that genuinely amused me. It was as though surviving something so frightening had burned away some of the smaller, quieter fears I had carried for years, without even realizing how heavy they had become. Leo noticed it too, one morning in the garden, watching me argue cheerfully with him over whether the roses needed more sun or more shade. "You're different," he said, not unkindly. "Since the warehouse, you stand up straighter." "I feel different," I admitted, turning a trowel over in my hands. I used to think being noticed was dangerous, like if I made myself smaller, nobody would ever have a reason to hurt me, or laugh at me, or decide I wasn't worth the trouble of caring about. I'm starting to think I had that backwards. Leo considered this for a moment, then nodded toward the house, toward the wing where Damien was undoubtedly buried in some business matter he would not fully explain to me until much later that evening. He'd say the same thing, if you asked him. About himself, I mean. Different words, probably, but the same idea. I thought about that often in the weeks that followed. The strange symmetry between a man who had built an empire out of refusing to be underestimated, and a woman who had spent years making herself as unremarkable as possible in the hope of avoiding pain. We had arrived at the same lesson from opposite directions, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, we had found each other in the middle of it. And Damien, slowly, carefully, let down walls I suspected few people had ever seen behind. He was not an easy man to know, even after everything we had survived together. He still disappeared for long hours on business, he rarely explained in detail, still carried himself with the controlled watchfulness of someone who had learned young that safety was never guaranteed. But in the small hours of evening, when the house grew quiet and the guards settled into their rotations, he sought me out without excuse or explanation, simply because, I began to understand, he wanted to. We talked about everything and nothing, sitting together in the garden as the sky darkened overhead. He told me about his mother, who had died when he was young, and about the particular loneliness of building an empire with no one left, who remembered him before the violence became necessary. I told him about the years I had spent believing my body made me unworthy of being truly seen, about the quiet, persistent ache of moving through a world that treated my presence as something to apologize for. I never understood that kind of cruelty, Damien said one evening, his hand finding mine on the bench between us. People spend their whole lives trying to make themselves feel bigger by making someone else feel smaller. It's the same instinct that built men like Lane, just with softer weapons. You don't see me that way, I said, not quite a question. I never saw you that way, he said. Not for 1 second, not from the very first moment in that alley. I saw someone the world had spent years underestimating, and I recognized exactly how dangerous that underestimation was, because I'd built half my career on the same mistake other people made about me. I turned to look at him fully, searching his face in the fading light. What do you mean? I mean that people saw where I came from, and assumed I would never be anything more than what my father was, he said quietly. They underestimated how far I would go to prove them wrong. I recognized that same fire in you that first night, even frozen against that wall. I just don't think anyone had ever given you the chance to prove it yet. Something in my chest cracked open at that. Some old wound I had carried since childhood finally beginning, slowly, to heal. Nobody had ever spoken to me the way Damien did, without pity, without the careful, condescending gentleness people often used when discussing my weight or my quietness, as though I were something fragile requiring careful handling. Damien spoke to me as an equal, as someone whose strength he respected rather than tolerated, and that difference changed something fundamental in how I understood myself. There were quieter moments too, ones that mattered just as much as the larger conversations. One rainy afternoon, when business kept every guard and advisor occupied elsewhere in the house, Damien found me curled up in the library with a book I was not really reading, and instead of retreating to his study as he usually did during the day, he sat down across from me and simply stayed, working through a stack of papers in comfortable silence, while rain traced patterns down the tall windows. Neither of us spoke for nearly an hour, and yet it was one of the most peaceful hours I could remember living through, the two of us simply existing in the same space without any danger pressing at the edges of it. Another evening, he asked me, almost shyly, if I would want to see the city properly, not from the back of a car racing away from danger, but as an ordinary outing, dinner somewhere quiet, a walk afterward through streets that held no immediate threat. I said yes before he even finished the question, and that night, dressed in something Grace had helped me choose, I walked beside Damien through streets lit gold by early evening light, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back, and felt, for the first time since the alley, that the city itself might belong to me as much as it belonged to anyone else. We did not talk about Marcus much after that first difficult week, though I noticed the way Damien's shoulders carried a little less weight as the following weeks passed, as though naming and confronting the betrayal had allowed him to finally set some part of it down. Victor Lane's silence, too, seemed to stretch on longer than anyone expected, and slowly, Cautiously, the house began to breathe easier, guards relaxing their constant vigilance by fractions, Grace humming softly to herself again while she cooked, the entire estate settling into something that almost resembled ordinary life. It was nearly 2 months after that first terrifying night in the alley, when Damien asked me to join him in the garden after dinner. His manner slightly different than usual, a careful nervousness I had never seen from him before. I found him standing near the small stone bench beneath the old oak tree, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Everything all right?" I asked, settling beside him. "I've been thinking," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "about the night I told my men you were my wife. I made that decision in about 10 seconds, purely as a way to keep you safe. I didn't ask you. I didn't consider what it might mean to actually make a claim like that on someone's life without their consent. I understood why you did it," I said. "I'm not angry about it." "I know," he said. "But I've had 2 months to think about what that word actually meant, once I stopped saying it purely as a strategy, and I've realized I don't want it to be a lie anymore. I don't want to be your husband in name only, as a shield against Lane, or anyone else who might come after us. I want it to be true, if you're willing to let it be." My breath caught somewhere in my throat, and for a moment, I could not find any words at all, only the overwhelming sensation of a lifetime of small, quiet rejections rearranging themselves around this single, unexpected moment of being chosen, fully and deliberately, by a man who had seen every part of me and found none of it wanting. "Damien," I managed finally. "You don't have to answer tonight," he said quickly, some of his usual composure slipping in a way that felt almost endearing. This man who commanded fear and respect from an entire criminal empire, suddenly uncertain in front of one ordinary woman. "I just needed you to know the truth of how I feel. Whatever you decide, you will always have a home here, a place where you are protected and valued exactly as you are." I reached for his hand, steadying myself as much as him. "I don't need time," I said. "I've spent my whole life being told, in 100 quiet ways, that I was something people settled for, something less than what they truly wanted. You have never once made me feel that way. Not for a single day since that night in the alley." "Is that a yes?" he asked, and something in his voice, some rare, unguarded hope, undid the last of my hesitation entirely. "That's a yes," I said, and the smile that broke across his face in that moment was unlike anything I had seen from him before, unguarded and genuine, the smile of a man who had spent his entire adult life expecting to fight for everything he had ever wanted, finally allowing himself a single, uncomplicated moment of simple happiness. He pulled me close, and I let myself lean into him fully, into the solid warmth of a man who had stepped between me and a bullet on the worst night of my life, and never once let go afterward. The garden around us, the one I had spent 2 months carefully coaxing back to life, seemed to hold its breath in the quiet evening air, as though it too understood the significance of what had just been decided beneath its branches. In the weeks that followed, word spread quickly through the city that Damien Cross's marriage, once rumored to be nothing more than a convenient shield, had become something else entirely. A genuine partnership that only seemed to strengthen his position rather than weaken it. Victor Lane, watching from whatever distance he now kept, apparently concluded that a man secure enough to build real happiness in the middle of an ongoing war was not a man worth testing further, and the fragile peace between their organizations held, season after season, longer than anyone had initially expected. I still thought sometimes about the woman I had been before that night in the alley, the quiet, overlooked print shop worker who walked the same 3 streets every evening, certain the world had already decided everything it needed to know about her worth. I did not resent her, exactly, though I understood now how small her expectations of life had become, how thoroughly she had learned to accept less than she deserved, simply because nobody had ever shown her another possibility. Damien had shown me that possibility, not through grand gestures or empty promises, but through 100 small, consistent choices, choosing to protect me when it would have been easier to walk away, choosing to listen when it would have been easier to dismiss, choosing me, again and again, in a world that had spent years teaching me nobody ever would. On the morning of our wedding, the real one, held quietly in the same garden where he had first asked me to let his claim become true, I stood at the edge of the stone path in a dress Grace had helped me choose, watching Damien wait for me beneath the old oak tree, his expression open in a way I suspected very few people beyond these walls had ever witnessed. I walked toward him slowly, unhurried, savoring every step of a moment I had never once imagined for myself, and when I reached him, he took my hands in his and looked at me the way he had looked at me that very first night, sharp and assessing and utterly certain, as though I were the single most important thing in any room he ever entered. "You are my wife now," he said quietly, echoing words spoken first in fear and danger, now spoken in nothing but certainty and love. "Not because I need to protect you, because I choose you, every day, for exactly who you are." I smiled, and for the first time in my entire life, I let myself believe, completely and without hesitation, that I was worthy of being chosen exactly as I was, and that the frightened woman who had once frozen against a brick wall in a dark alley had finally, fully, come home.